All right, greetings, ancient history class. Welcome to early medieval England. You are responsible for watching these slides and watching the YouTubes that are also on the email with this, because it's all fodder for your final exam. So here we go. All right, in review from what Mr. Hahn has been covering earlier, is we want to talk a little bit about what's happened in England up to the point where we're covering today. The importance of England to us is this is our mother country, so we need to know these basics of English history. So the Romans pulled out of England in 410, and you can see on the map there the part of the island that they're Roman Britons. As soon as they left, the Picts and the Scots up from Scotland crossed Hadrian's Wall, you'll remember Hadrian's Wall, and began raiding the former territory. And as you remember, Mr. Hahn was saying, 3 times the Britons called out to the Romans and said, come and rescue us. And the 3rd time they came, they said, we can't do this anymore. Look to your own defenses. So within 40 years, the Romans could not come back and do any more rescues. And the local Britons were not military ready. And so they were reduced to asking for help from mercenaries. So they offered land and food to the Saxons across the water there in return for military support. The Saxons liked the land so much that they decided that they would like to stay and take over for things themselves. So you can see on the map here, here's England. And so the Britons own this part, and they have called out for help from these guys. So the Jutes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisi, and a little bit from the Frankish coast. Mostly these Angles and Saxons, and the Frisians are their big supporters who've come over now as mercenaries and want to take over the island because it's so. Interesting side note, in the Battle of Mount Badon in the 400s, that was actually one of the few battles won by a Roman Briton king, Ambrosium Aurelius. And so according to ancient legend, Arthur was his descendant and fought there with the king, so the legendary King Arthur that Mr. Hahn has talked about. By 550, many of the Britons had fled to the western part of the island. So you can see on the map there, England in this far west part of the island, or across the water into the land of the Franks and settled Brittany, comes from the name Britain. The Anglo-Saxons had set up 7 independent kingdoms now. So we have Northumbria in the middle north part of the island. This is still the Picts and the Scots up here. So Northumbria here, Mercia in the middle, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. And then the Britons and the Celts relegated over here to the Welsh area. So here are the 7 Anglo-Saxon little independent kingdoms that have been set up. Notice that Wessex, Sussex, and Essex are really West Saxon, East Saxon, South Saxon. So the Saxons were warrior peoples. The Saxon kings were called ring givers. This meant that in the Old Norse tribe tradition that they gathered the spoils of war and generously shared them with their thanes, so everybody got rich off of war. There was no central government on the island. Each of the small kingdoms often feuded with each other, and the kings arguing with each other in eye for an eye sort of feudal fashion. And so the only atonement for an offense was death. So if, it would go on and on, or getting married to the offended person's daughter. So the Saxons religiously had gods that were similar to the Viking gods. So we get our weekday names from some of those, like Tuesday is Chua the dark god, and Wednesday from Woden the war god, Thursday from Thor the thunder god, Friday from Frigga the home goddess. The Saxon gods were very capricious and unpredictable. They ruled people for their own benefit. They were very self-interested kind of gods, sort of like the Greek gods. that what happened then when the Roman Britons were in charge of the island, by the time of the end of the Roman Britain era, a large part of that population was Christian. In fact, in 314, the Council of Arles in Gaul included 3 British bishops. So Christianity is a very common thing. But with the coming of the Saxons, the Christian population is pretty much obliterated or moves away. And so there are a few Celtic monasteries left, and that's about it. So then the island eventually needs more and new missionary activities. So by 563, the Irish send over St. Columba as a missionary. And so St. Columba is famous. If you are in England, you have to know about him. So he was sent to be a missionary to the Picts. They're up in the north part of the island. And he settled there at originally at Loch Ness. And so that one of the legendary miracles that he did was he saved one of the local Picts and also one of his disciples from the Loch Ness monster as it was terrorizing people, and told the Loch Ness monster that he had to stay in the deep water and couldn't come near the shore. And then he also caused King Britti's gates to come open when the king wouldn't welcome him in. He just went up to the gates and just said open, and the gates did. In 597, the Pope Gregory sent St. Augustine to Christianize the Saxons. So this was the first major Roman Catholic missionary to the island in that time period. So this is not the St. Augustine that you hear about, who's one of the church doctors. This is the St. Augustine missionary to England. And then by 627, then the Roman Catholics had converted King Edwin of Northumbria, and so then Christianity quickly began through his work spreading to other Saxon kingdoms. There were monasteries started around the island, and they became very common. Some were of the Celtic origin from like St. Columba's work or his friend St. Aidan. So in 623, St. Aidan established a monastery at Lindisfarne in the Northumbria region, and he works just like the Celtic monasteries tended to do, is to work to kind of care for the local population, and were involved in their lives, and so caused people want to convert to Christianity. And then there were also Catholic monasteries started around the island also. This, interestingly, is the Lindisfarne Abbey that was destroyed by the Vikings 150 years later, we talked about last week. The uniting of the Celtic Christians and the Saxon Roman Catholics, so the two people groups and their two faiths, were joined in 663 when St. Hilda, who was the abbess at Whitby, hosted a synod of Celtic Christian leaders and Roman Catholic Christian leaders, and they got together and they debated, and they finally decided the best thing for the island is to have a unified faith, everybody working together. And so the Celts decided to join the Roman Catholic Church. The difference in governmental styles of the two branches of the faith there, the Celtic Christians were decentralized. There were monasteries around, but they didn't have influence over each other. And the Catholic Church is, of course, a very powerful centralized organization headed by the Pope. So Saxons then are coming to be a very hodgepodge of religious and governmental ideas. So the Saxons, being young in their faith, brought a lot of their Saxon roots into their religious life. So they looked at God like they did their ancient gods, as kind of unpredictable and capricious, that people were there to serve God, and he was more interested in himself than in the welfare of his people. Kind of a self-centered God, and kings ruling in his stead would rule like him. So they tended to be at times more interested in the affairs of the king than the affairs of the people. And then Catholic services by that time were held in Latin, so people would go to church and have their ritual, but understood very little about the scriptures or the stories of the faith. So they didn't have an anchor, and most of them were illiterate and couldn't read, and there were very few Bibles anyway. So this is a picture of St. Hilda's Abbey there in Whitby, what's left. The king that broke that tradition was King Alfred the Great. Remember him? We talked about last time. He's the King Alfred who held off the Vikings from taking over Wessex, and the Vikings took over most of the island. So Alfred broke the trend of illiteracy and spiritual ignorance when he was king from 871 to 889. And he promoted literacy throughout his nation, his little country there of Wessex. And he required all of his officials and church leaders to be literate. Notice that? He broke the mold. He was the only guy around that required all his officials and church leaders to be literate. He opened a court school for children of nobles and promising commoners. So he kind of, set the country up and running. He was influenced by Charlemagne. They were there in the land of the Franks, who had been busy doing that kind of thing earlier. He was a very devout Christian, and so he worked hard to get the church to train their local priests well in scripture and literacy, because they didn't tend to be, and so people couldn't know scripture and couldn't really, what God was truly like. See, look at this, how Wales is, and you see this line from here to here on Wales, okay? As actually a dike built by King Offa of Northumbria to keep the Britons out, because the Britons and the Celts there were beginning to be pesky to them. This disunified island with all these small countries, everybody arguing with each other. So this dike that Offa built to divide the Welsh from the Saxon areas was up to 65 feet wide and 25 feet deep in the trench, and then a diked wall there, and manned by bonfires for communication. So kind of like in the Lord of the Rings, you remember the bonfire scene. So I actually have a video in there for you to watch it now. So the Norse by the 1000s were ruling much of the island until King Canute died in 1035. And you'll remember his story of putting his feet in the ocean to show that he could not turn back the tide. That was God's own thing. After he died, there was arguing between his sons and stepsons, and so there's no clear heir. So in 1042, Edward the Confessor, who was a Saxon and the half-brother of the last temporary Norse king there, so he took the throne of the English part of Canute's empire, so he was the king there in England. He was a very devoutly religious man. He spent a lot of his efforts in doing pious things like building monasteries and cathedrals. This is one of his most famous is Westminster Cathedral, where the British kings and queens are still crowned. So Edward the Confessor was well beloved and was a saint of England for a while, until St. George was chosen to be the patron saint of England. Edward the Confessor died without an heir, and he left 3 men vying for the throne. 2 of them he had promised that they would be the heir, they would be the next king. So the last man who was promised the throne was Harold Godwin, or Godwinson, according to who's writing the history there. He was a powerful Saxon earl, not in the bloodline for the throne. The first man who had been promised the throne by Edward the Confessor was William of Poitiers, who was the Duke of Normandy, and he was a distant relation of King Edward the Confessor. He was a Norman living in Normandy. He was illegitimately born, but his father was a duke, so he assumed dukedom when his father died, and he married into royalty because he married Matilda, the daughter of the Count of Flanders. So anyway, there was also the third contender for the throne who was not promised the throne, but he wanted it. He was the grandson of Harald Hardrada, the king, Canute's grandson, the king of Norway. So he was already king of Norway, but he wanted to restore King Canute's empire and take over the island. So he joined forces with Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig. Tostig was mad at his brother for betraying them earlier in their lives. And so this Tostig and King Harald Hardrada of Norway decided to take the English throne by force. So as soon as Edward the Confessor dies, Harold Godwin, who's a Saxon, has himself crowned king in Westminster Cathedral because he chose that to show that he was clearly Edward the Confessor's successor, because Edward had built that cathedral. William, who's the Duke of Normandy, had also been promised the throne, and he wasn't happy that Edward had taken it. So in fact, Edward in the past had sworn to serve him. So this is big, lots of broken promises going on here. So he's really, really upset about that. Back in England on Coronation Day, when Harold is crowned, Halley's Comet flew overhead, and so the local people took it as a bad omen about Harold. All right, then there's Harold Hardrada, the king of Norway, and he invades England in the northern middle part of the island, because he's going to capture the throne there with Tostig, Harold Godwin's brother, and there's a large battle waged at Stamford Bridge. So legend says that one Norwegian berserker stood on the bridge and single-handedly fended off the Saxons with simply an axe. He only had an axe. Until a wily Saxon floated in a barrel under the bridge and stabbed him with a spear from between the wooden planks. So Harold, the Saxon king, had mostly with him the local farmer soldiers. You know, everybody, all males were trained in some kind of military preparation in those days. And so local farmer militia kind of guys were called fyrd. And they were called up in haste from all around the region to help King Harold fend off the Norwegians there at Stamford Bridge. And they were able to defeat those Norwegians. Meanwhile, William has gathered a force of 15,000 trained in the latest military tactics. So they're not fyrd, they're trained knights, and they're sailing from Normandy, and he lands at Pevensey. So up here is Stamford Bridge, and way down here is Pevensey. So King Harold has to defend his title, his crown, from, he's up here, and he's got to get down here to fend off William. William moves his forces to Hastings, burning and pillaging along the way to gain supplies and reduce resistance from the locals. William's men throw up a motte and bailey castle. This was common in Europe, but not in England. They throw this up, the castle, but they occupy the low ground at the foot of the hill. Interestingly, Motte and Bailey castles consist of a central tower built on a mound with wooden walls, kind of like wings on each side, and those are also on a mound. Motte and Bailey castles are built to protect the soldiers. This is different than the traditional Saxon castles, which are called burgs, and those were built around a town to protect a town. So different viewpoints in what a castle's for. So Harold and his Saxons arrive after several days of traveling. They had swung by London and picked up some more professional soldiers, and so he has a bunch of skilled things. So there are more Normans than there are Saxons by history's report. But the Saxons are well trained. The fighting style of the Saxons is the traditional Roman style shield wall. So the Saxons would ride horses up to the battlefields, those that had horses, but they would dismount and fight on foot in that lock shield form. This is been around now for centuries. The Normans come with William. They have the well-trained cavalry, so it's the new, and as Mr. Hahn calls it, the new secret weapon, which was the knight. All right, so thus happens the most famous battle of English history. You know, in America, we have to know some battles. We have to know Lexington and Concord, which is the American Revolution shot that's heard around the world. And the Americans have to know the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, anybody who has, you know, Britain in their bloodline, like all Americans, we should know the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So this is the greatest battle in English history. So Harold and his army have their shield wall and the high ground, and they hold against William's archers. The Saxon line advances, and William is unhorsed. The Normans, thinking William is dead, begin to flee. So he stands up and pushes back his helmet and says, "I live, and with God's help I will conquer." The Saxons pursue the fleeing Normans. The Normans, encouraged that William lives, turn around and give chase to the Saxons. So in order to pursue the Normans, the Saxons have broken their shield wall and make space then for the Norman cavalry to break through and trample down those shields. Harold is hit in the eye with an arrow and killed. The Normans break the Saxon line, mutilate Harold's body, and gain victory in the battle. The end of Saxon England and the birth of Norman England have happened. So William is now William the Conqueror, and he is crowned king in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. Interestingly, the guards outside, when they hear the shouts of joy inside the cathedral, fear that William is being attacked, and so to punish the town, they start burning the town down. So, which is foretells the reign of William. So, William creates a centralized government by a reign of terror. So, anywhere that the Saxons did not quickly sign on in loyalty to him, they are destroyed. 3 years after 1066 and 1069, the Danes invade in York, kind of at the invitation of the locals who are tired of the abuse by the Normans. And they want the descendant, who's a direct descendant of Edward the Confessor, to be put on the throne. His name is Edgar the Atheling, which means the crown-worthy. He's a very, very young man at the time. So he's being suckered in on all this. So the Danes invade York, which is in the middle north part where Northumbria is. And so William answers this invasion by the harrying of the north. This is very famous, where he burned and slaughtered throughout York. In fact, the whole, from coast to coast, middle part of the island, throughout all of Yorkshire, he burns and destroys every living thing. So at least tens of thousands of people died. Estimates say up to 100,000 people were killed. Every single farm, animal, any other animal, tree, or plant that they could find was destroyed. Parts of it took decades and parts up to 100 years for the north to recover there from that harrying of the north. So William has a very strong centralized government by now, and he introduces the European-style feudalism. It was a very centralized government. The king owned everything, you know, land, people, animals, trees, and he parceled it out to earls and barons. You can see in this diagram how that looks. The earls and barons do not own the land, the king does, and they run the land for the king. The earls and barons parcel land out to the knights, who serve the earls and barons, but don't own the land. The king owns the land. And then they parcel land out to the peasants, and the peasants don't own the land. The king owns the land, and they give them, you know, parts of what they raise to take care of all these people higher in the hierarchy. This is, of course, in contrast to the Saxon feudal system, which was decentralized and in the care of local earls. There's just a different worldview there. So William also centralizes the government by showing people he owns every single thing in the country, down to the last chicken, through having the Doomsday Book, composed. So he sends out his recorders all over the island, and they take record of every single thing in England, every person, every town, every farm animal, every plow, just everything in the economy is documented. William's half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, ordered a tapestry made depicting the story of William and the Battle of Hastings. It's kind of like our modern day mangas or comic books. It's for local people who couldn't read to remember all that William had done, so they could go into the whole story of William the Conqueror is on this tapestry. So from William the Conqueror's viewpoint, he considered himself a Christian, even though, he burned and pillaged and, murdered hundreds of thousands of people. He saw himself as God's representative, and as God's representative, he was like God. And if God was the kind of person who would do things like that, it was cool for William to do that. So he had that old, capricious view of God. Very different than the scripture, but then he didn't know scripture, so he didn't have any other way to reign. So interesting for those of you guys who would like to know what Tillmans are from. So the Tillmans are Saxon in origin, maybe from Friesland originally, but had long settled with the Saxons in the Kent area of the island. So it's the southern part of the island in the town of Snodland. They became vassals of William and prospered, under his ruling. And this is a church that they built in 1100. Okay, so now your job is to go watch the videos that are in this email also. So they will emphasize the things that we have covered in the lesson to help you remember better. Also read the textbook, and I will be getting the questions to you also. Maybe I will get those in this email also, and you can just print them out. Okay. All right. And so this is all fodder for the final exam, so don't miss any of it, and have fun on this snow and ice day.